This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Some of you know that I've been a teacher or mentor, both at different times, for Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop over the years. And this spring, I'm going to be teaching my workshop, Memory, Emotion, Body. Because of COVID and lockdowns and the strange couple of years we've had, I am unable to teach it in the facilities. It's going to be a video course. Now, what this means for you is I'm putting together a live classroom through Zoom of the Memory, Emotion, Body workshop. And because of these special circumstances, doing it for the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop, I'm offering the live component at a pay-what-you-can sliding fee. So I hope to see you in this class. It is all about the story writer's first tools, our memories, emotions, and our physical bodies, and how we can mine and access our personal experience to create moving, compelling, sensory prose on the page for our readers that transports them into a lived experience. You can get all of the details about the workshop and sign up at storyworksfiction.com. And again, you can also just go to storyworkspodcast.com to today's episode, to this post. All of the links will be right there. You can learn more about Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop, more about the workshop itself, and also sign up and pay what you can. Hello, and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are discussing time. What is it? How do you get it onto the page? It's good to start with a laugh. So, Robert, I think you suggested this topic. So why has time been on your mind? Help us dig in.
Yeah, just some separate study and nothing specific that caught my mind, where I'm rereading something and then I was studying something else more formally and thinking, yeah, okay, that's good to put my attention on, because I've thought about it in the past and used it in the past in orchestrating story to show time jumps, time leaps, or trying to pull someone in the moment. And then we've talked about it, of course, with, say, action scenes or fight scenes or love scenes where you want to, slow down things but still have them happen, feel like they're happening fast for the characters. So it occurred to me it's actually quite a skill to be able to do it without being clunky. And so I thought it'd be good to sort of riff on and talk about without sort of having the obvious things like, she glanced up at the clock and it was already past.
Right.
So, is there another way, like, for example, she took a sip of the coffee, it was already cold. That's another way you can show things, without actually making overt references to time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking as you were talking about film and how they're really going to show you the beats as they occur, because the actors are moving in real time and in real space. So until they get to a jump cut or do a montage or something, that is how the action proceeds. But as writers with narrative, we've got superpowers and we can slow down and accelerate time without necessarily needing to do a scene break or a chapter break, that jump cut effect. And we can stretch and expand time without making it feel like a camera going slow motion, because I think the reason it works is because the reader's attention is right there with the narrative. And so the reader isn't watching it externally. The reader is in it. Almost, maybe participant is a little too active of a word, but the reader is there with the character, vicariously participating. And so as a reader, we get that kind of ebb and flow of time in a really organic way with story.
Yeah, I really like this thing that I'm reading at the moment where it dips in and out of real time, and then you get it's like if you're watching a video that you recorded and you're using the sort of the scrubber thing to suddenly move it along, and then let it go, and you go, oh, this is the bit I wanted to see, where the baby laughs, that sort of thing, and so you get these sort of bits that are sped up really effectively because they're expositional, although they're delivered from a character. And then all of a sudden you're in the next bit of the action. And I think, well, that suits this particular story because we're in some fast action. But also, you've got those other things, say, in fantasy where you might want to show how millennia have passed by that have brought these, immovable and irresistible forces very slowly together until we're now locked in some kind of factional thing that's just got to be pulled apart piece by piece, brick by brick. So I think, it's a fascinating thing because, as you say, Alida, we experience time always as if it's in the present time within milliseconds. But when we read, we go all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, time is not linear. I think that's the biggest thing. As you're talking about this, it's like story doesn't need to approach time in a linear fashion, right? So sometimes that can jar our brains and our writer brains into having to rethink things. But I'm working on a short story right now where I'm kind of like doing this thing where I introduce the next main thing and then I backfill what happened in the time in between, right? And so it's like the reader anticipates, but then also gets to kind of live a little bit of it. And it's kind of a fun play with time. So you get that jump, just kidding, move forward, just kidding. But it's like really playful. So it's just kind of a fun way of moving the story forward without moving it forward in a linear step-by-step fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you denote the changes? What do you devices do you use to?
Well, I think we all. We have time language, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, in the 9 years that passed, or as he grew from, this to this, or, whatever. And so you get that a little bit of it's, narrative exposition that's transitioning the time frame, right? But you've kind of played with it a little bit. So you get more of a circular movement forward rather than just a push straight through line. So your reader doesn't just read it like an info dump. They read it in anticipation of what you've already given them, right? This is where we were headed. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. I think it's a mistake to think of stories needing to be told chronologically, or if chronologically as being a given, a go-to means of relating a story to a reader. If you look at memoir, especially, there's a lot of movement through time. Memoirists hardly ever say, this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened, because they're focusing on the thematic content and the emotional content, and they're working with memory and how the mind makes sense of past experiences in relation to present and other experiences and such. And so our stories, if you look at them, we don't think about them and create meaning by going bump, bump, bump on a timeline. We do it in this much more kind of swirly fashion that might seem chaotic, but it's all a process of making meaning, pulling these little things together from different timescapes, different realms, to find the coherence within them.
Yeah. I remember doing, when I first started writing and getting into all this sort of action stuff, and then realizing I have no idea how much time has passed. I think it was when I was starting to do revisions, and I was doing a sort of a beat sheet of like in reverse. So I didn't have that prior. I'd just gone back through all the scenes and logged everything that happened. I thought, oh, hang on a minute, this looks like about 35 things happened in one day. I think I need to sort of try and somehow sort that out and tease it out a bit more as well. So there's the fact that you can without know it when you're drafting, get the time wrong, because in your head you've slowed it all down a lot. And as a reader, then that might seem like, hang on a minute, even if it's unconsciously, this doesn't work, or how could all this have happened inside one school year, for example, or those sort of things. So which wasn't really what I was coming to in terms of time for this particular episode, but it just occurred to me that it happens whether you like it or not in your story. So both of you mentioned that, it doesn't have to be chronological, but it also has to fit,
Right. Yes. And sometimes chronological is the best way to tell the story. So I'm not saying rule it out, but don't be limited by it either. And, for some reason, I like to tell really long stories, like Saving Annabelle covers about 12 years. And obviously you can't write a 12-year long novel. And so I'm constantly dealing with the passage of time and big time jumps. And then over the course of a novel with that many jumps, you don't want it to be redundant. You don't want it to just feel like, and the leaves turned on the trees, and the leaves turned on the trees, right? So it's part of managing time is knowing what your story demands and then finding ways to do it organically within that story so that it isn't a tedium.
I think that invisible time issue is kind of interesting, Robert. Like I was thinking about that as you were talking about how I just finished watching the last season of The Expanse on Amazon. And that's a series where you can easily forget that there is time passing because there's no like sunrise, sunset, sleep patterns. Like there's not that, right? They're floating in space, but you still get those senses of time passing in the, the action and then release of action. What do you call that? The recuperation moments, right? The relaxation moments. So even if you can't tell, oh my gosh, it's been 3 months or whatever, because it's not always up in your face action, you get that sense of time passing, them recovering and then moving on. So even without like your normative time markers, we can still get that sense of time passing or not passing if you want it to be quick and all together, right? So
interesting. Have either of you ever played with writing something that doesn't have time as we know it as the framework for the story?
Yeah, you mean in terms of seconds and minutes and things like that, or
or days, weeks, months, like what Kathryn was just describing. I was like, oh, how interesting. How would that work?
You got to be so careful because it can get so confusing, right? Yes. So if you're creating an alternate time, right? Oh man, like we don't have normal days and months don't exist, then either you're not going to deal with it much and it's just like a little oddity that kind of makes the reader go, oh, that's fun. Or it's going to take your story over because you're trying to explain it all the time. So there's kind of a balance there in terms, it's that familiar versus unfamiliar thing, right? Like you can't have too much unfamiliar. So I think what The Expanse does really well, they don't even talk about it really, but you kind of notice, right? Oh, wait, hold on. Like, has it been a day? Has it been a month? Like, we don't really know, but we know time has passed and that's really all that matters. They don't really need to explain all of that, right? We just kind of exist in this ever-present darkness because we're in space.
And in the books, there's a bit of expositional as well that explains that at first they tried to mimic the normal Earth, diurnal days, and then they realized that didn't make any sense. So they went on a full 24-hour thing, and then they realized that also confused people. So they were still kept going with the 24-hour thing, but they made the night times slightly dimmer and different because our bodies have evolved to accept the fact that there's night and day. So I thought that was interesting, but they didn't sort of but after that it was done. Once it was inserted into the story, then and that's pretty close to the start. But I've read things before where they've tried to do different time units, and you're just forever translating in your head. It's annoying.
Yeah, and that's such a great craft point that if you're doing something unusual, you've got to establish it for the reader. It has to be known, understood, and accepted by the reader, and then you can move forward. But if you're doing something really variable, you're going to encounter what you just said, Robert, where the reader's like, what?
I think if you're going to play with the idea of time, normative time versus non-normative time, it's better to play with it in terms of structure, right? Like I'm thinking Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Like nothing in that book is in order, right? I mean, so if you're going to play with time, I think it's better to play with it in terms of chronology and linearity,
yes.
or maybe that sort of thing, rather than playing with hours and minutes and days and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Have you two done that? Have you played with structure that way? Well, you just mentioned the story you're writing currently, Kathryn.
Yeah, I've done it both that way, kind of circular. And then I've also done some play with flashbacks so that the scenes, like some move forward and some move backward. And it's fun because you do get to explore story structure in a different way, right? So you're giving plot points in different time frames and then somehow making it come together at the end. I wouldn't necessarily say I was spectacularly successful with it, but it was an enjoyable exercise, and something that I think would help me if I ever tried to do like a flashback scene in a novel or something like that, just to feel what that feels like, to make it important and weighty, and mean something. So
yeah, that's cool. How about you, Robert? Have you played?
No, not really. I think because of the genres I tend to read tend to be very present moment action type things. Some sci-fi, that I've read has obviously got lots of, you do have big flashback things, unless they're really well done. I find them, they can bore me because I want to be back where the main character is doing the things the main character is doing. And that's just a personal quirk. It's not necessarily one thing or the other. So I haven't played with it much. I came across, we were tidying up the garage the other day, and I found my old file of stories to be written and little things that I'd tried that were just a one-page thing. And one of them is some weird science fiction thing about time where the guy's wearing a watch and it keeps counting down to 0 or something. So yeah.
Sounds like a Twilight Zone episode.
Right, yeah. And I've always liked those weird idea things like that. So, I like the idea of the sort of interstellar stuff, and The Forever War is a fantastic sci-fi book which does massive leaps through time because of the issue of relativity. So, there are times in science fiction where time becomes an important part of what it is that you're dealing with. In my current work, I've had to deal with it because they have faster than light. They have time jumps. They can do hyper jumps. So I just got around it by using a convention that was established ages ago. And so, but not, hyper jumps, doesn't necessarily mean you can instantly leap from one end of the universe to the other. You have to do a series of hops. They take time, and some of that is actually serving as a little bit of a plot device at the moment as well, where the main character knows that she has access to news that won't reach certain parts of the galaxy for another probably 48 to 72 hours. So, I think those sort of things can be interesting to use. But no, I do tend to write in present time. I think. I don't know. I have to go back and look at it now.
Yeah.
Because, we must all obviously have characters who reflect on something that has happened in order to make a decision or project something out into the future in order to decide what to do with their crisis, I guess, whether it's on the page or not. So.
Yeah.
But the thing that makes me curious is, and you mentioned The Expanse, and in the books, there's a huge amount of time passes that they chose not to deal with in the TV series because it would have meant aging the characters considerably and some characters' deaths. But how do you deal with it, Alida? You're writing over, say, 12 years or so, and there are people who are writing, generational or family sagas. How do you deal with that and still keep the sense of reality for the reader and keep them attached to the character, or if you have to switch characters because the character they were following has now passed on, and we're picking up the story in a new generation.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, I mean, if you think about writing, let me just finish a minute. If we went back, say, 20 years ago, even, we didn't have iPhones. We didn't have social media. So, do you have to take account of those sort of things depending on the period you're writing into? If you're writing over a period of large change, you've got to take into account if it's real or not, sort of sci-fi or fantasy, what happened in culture around them and politics.
Yeah, you do. You definitely do. I mean, I think the first part is your reader has to be attached to your characters and to the arc of the story itself. If it's a story that covers a lot of years, the arc of the story, it's meaningful that all of those years occur, even though everything that happens in those years isn't meaningful, right? That's why you cut those chunks. And so I think the reader just understands that you're going to see like this episode for however many chapters. And then like Saving Annabelle is not in parts. It's continuous. It's all one novel. So then I deal with the children aging, the town growing. So my narrator, Greta, her father had a grain. Wow, totally blanking on the word I want, right? But anyway, he set up a grain stop for the farmers so they didn't have to go on to Red Wing. And then he opens a cooperage so they can make their own barrels right on site. So then, these sorts of things indicate the passage of time, but I don't have to show the cooperage being built and such like that. Greta just reflects on, or I think in one chapter, she's writing a letter to somebody who had moved away from town saying, oh, guess what? Now there's a cooperage and now there are more people. And now we've got a restaurant run by a widow and her daughter. And so those things create change, but within the continuity of the whole story.
And do you set up expectations for that right at the start? I suppose I'm thinking about stories where I've read where I'm really attached to the character, and then all of a sudden, 20 years pass, and okay, with the same character, but it's sort of it was a little jarring. Whereas with yours, obviously, it sounds as if you've already got that baked in. That to some degree, it feels like it's a part of the tone and the voice.
Right.
Are there different ways to address that, and not jar the reader, or sometimes you might want to do it deliberately, I suppose?
Yeah, I suppose you could want to jar the reader. In Saving Annabelle, it's a first-person narrator, and so the narrative voice is not only consistent, but it's the character's voice. And so at the beginning of the story, she's a young child, but as narrator, she's a young adult. And so you are attaching as a reader to both the child and the narrator who's doing the reflecting and the storytelling. And I think if the reader only attached to the actor in the scene and not to the narrator, to the storyteller, there could be some disconnect there when, if you really like little Greta and then suddenly she's prepubescent and you're like, ooh, I don't care about her. I just like the kid, right? You need, and then you need to care about the action too. So the source of the conflict never changes through the 12 years.
Right.
So it's always Greta versus the main antagonist. And so, how many of us can say we're always facing the same obstacles in our lives? Hopefully they change as we change and we go through different stages of life. But for this 12-year novel, there's a lot of change happening over 12 years, but it's always that main question of how is she going to get out of this, the primary conflict in the novel.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're attaching the reader to that as well as the narrator, and you've set up the device there where she's already narrating about herself as a girl. So you've got some sense that this is a meta narrator who's understanding how time has passed or is passing. Okay, so that helps. Yeah,
right. Yeah, and you understand that Greta, as her own narrator, is going to share with you the pieces of her life that matter, that are relevant to her story and her journey. And it's Greta telling her story. But if you asked her, she's the protagonist of the novel, but if you ask Greta whose story she's telling, she would probably say she's telling her sister's story, Annabelle, hence the title. But then it's also her mother and father's story, and there's this town, and there are these supporting characters. And so you have a lot of attachment points into the story, but the one that's going to be the driver, where I think you're either going to keep or lose your reader, is the narrator, protagonist, and the primary source of conflict, the one driving the whole arc.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's probably where some generational sagas fall down, is that you're just doing lots of different slices of life. And if you wanted to make it better, you'd have a central thread of antagonism through it, which would be more interesting, I guess, and allow you to forgive the jump cuts and suddenly new characters being introduced because the old ones have passed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you have to set that reader expectation early. And I think this is one where your marketing copy works for you too, right? Because you want to get the reader who wants that sort of a story where they know ahead of time this is what's coming. And even if it's not like super clear in your marketing copy, make it clear in the beginning. Like I was just thinking where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, we know in the beginning she's grown up, and then the first chapter is she's a kid, so we know we're getting there, right? We're going to make this journey of growth with her. A lot of coming of age novels are like that, right? Where they might show us the flash of who we're going to get, and then we get to lead up to that. I was just thinking about Alida, have you read 100 Years of Solitude?
Mm-mm. No,
that was a really, I think you would enjoy it. It's been a while since I've read it, but the second you said generational, Robert, that was where my brain went, because it covers 100 years of this family, right? But they don't spend a lot of time on the culture or the town or anything else, because their focus is solely on the interiority of this family and the kind of crazy that they are. And so again, you have set that expectation for the reader from the beginning, like, you're just exploring this family for 100 years and kind of seeing how the insanity progresses. And it's beautifully written book. But so just a couple little quick examples thrown out there.
Nice.
And the implication in the title there as well is that it's very internal, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not, I don't even think I could have placed it in a time frame. I think they may have put it in a historical time frame, but I don't even remember. It wasn't important to the story being told. So
interesting. Other thoughts or questions on time before we wrap up this episode?
I think this is where your clever little devices like beats and things can come in really into play that really help. Even if you're doing big jumps or little jumps, or that just clue the reader in, that don't necessarily disturb the story. Like I've said at the start, the coffee going cold, or she glanced up and the sun had already gone down. So you can use things that you and I would notice as we're going through a day. Oh God, grief! I can't believe it. The day's almost over and I still haven't done these things yet. Or I'm really tired, but I've still got 2 things to do, and it's almost midnight. Those are ways that we can show time having an effect on the character as well, without necessarily, referring to time itself.
12 minutes later.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, please no.
But the thing about all these things is that they have their place, don't they? So, it depends on what you're writing and how it's done. So I guess what we're saying is, don't make it clunky, make it appropriate to the genre, the type of story you're telling, and the fit for the reader. And wherever you can do it, foreshadow in some way, shape, or form if you're planning to do some quite crazy things with time.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you definitely need to establish whatever you're planning to do if you're going to write in non-normative time. I like that term, Kathryn. Normative time and non-normative time. All right.
We're out of time.
We are out of time. Time's up, people.
Time's up.
Time's up.
Time's over.
Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.